Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special webinar today through our National Mentoring Resource Center project. This is Mike Geringer, the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and one of the folks that helps support the National Mentoring Resource Center for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Very excited about today's event, and I think folks are going to get a lot out of the conversation today. This is a really special topic and one that I've been looking forward to kind of doing a few webinars around for well over a year now. It's a really interesting project and a really interesting research study that we're going to learn about over today and the course of another webinar at the end of November here. But I just really am thrilled that we finally get a chance to talk about this project with the field and really talk about what we've learned about making enhancements to kind of business as usual mentoring in a mentoring program. And I think there's a lot to chew on from today's conversation. Got two great presenters with us today that were both instrumental in the research side of the Mentoring Enhancement Demonstration Program, and that is Janet Forbush, who's an independent consultant who really worked extensively on this project, worked with many of the sites around the country that were implementing these enhancements, and then also Roger Jarjura, who's a principal researcher at AIR and really was the lead investigator on this evaluation that we'll be talking about today. This webinar is going to focus on kind of what the project was, the implementation of it in the field, the enhancements that many of these programs around the country came up with and why they came up with those enhancements. And then at the webinar that we're having on the 30th, we're going to dive deeper into kind of the final outcomes and the results of it, and how that impacted what young people got from their mentor and how that impacted their outcomes from the program. So if you haven't signed up for that one on the 30th, you can find the link to that on the NMRC website and get registered for that one as well. Just a few quick housekeeping things here. As you probably guessed, attendee phones are muted for best sound, and give Roger and Janet a chance to talk about their work. But you can submit questions throughout the presentation using the question panel in the little control panel that everyone should have on their screen. And so I encourage folks to type in questions. We'll stop about halfway through and ask a couple of good ones. We'll save some time at the end. And, I also want folks to know this session is being recorded. So you'll get like an actual video recording of this after the fact, as well as a copy of the slides. So some of our slides today are pretty detail rich, and so don't feel like you have to take frantic notes or try and do screen captures of every slide that pops up on the screen. We'll be sure to share those with folks in an email next week. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Roger Jarjura, and he's going to kind of walk us through the basics of this program and kind of start getting into the findings of what all we've learned about it. So take it away, Roger.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And Janet and I are going to go back and forth a bit here, but I'm going to just make some introductory remarks so you can go ahead to the next slide. So just some quick acknowledgments here. So, Janet and I have the honor of being able to present to you today, but we really, are just two in a really large team of people that worked on the project. And so you can see on the screen, it really, included, we had a really rich team, senior design team, many people who you know of, heard of them, know them. And we have a team at AIR working on the analysis, and then a very large data management team that helped. We have some other folks who assisted us along the way as well. And just a special greeting from OJJDP. So Jen Tyson is actually right now at a conference and could not be with us today, but she sends her regards and otherwise would have been with us to greet everybody. Go ahead to the. And just a quick disclaimer, this project was funded by OJJDP through an interagency agreement with the Library of Congress, but the views expressed here are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the. So here, just to give you a quick sort of, sense of what MADP was, so the Mentoring Enhancement Demonstration Program, right, grew out of findings from the meta-analysis by Dubois and his colleagues from 2011, and so folks at OJJDP took notice and thought it might be a good idea to try to test some of those findings out, and so they developed a solicitation for MADP focusing on 3 of 6 key moderators of program effectiveness. Encouraging mentors to take on built-in advocacy functions in their role, building in teaching and information provision as part of their role, and also the matching of mentors and youth based on similarity of interests. This was a demonstration approach. The idea was to understand if and how a general strategy that involved encouraging and supporting training, teaching and advocacy functions in programmatic mentoring relationships could change local practices and then in turn influence youth outcomes. So that's really what we were all about for the evaluation. So I'm going to let Janet talk more about everything that was involved in the initiative.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Mike, for bringing us all together, and good afternoon or good morning to all of the webinar participants. Roger mentioned the predicate of the solicitation for the Mentoring Enhancement Demonstration Program, which is the meta-analysis of Dubois and his colleagues that was published in 2011. I think it's important to highlight that because previous initiatives that were funded in the mentoring arena by OJJDP, including the juvenile mentoring program that began in the early 90s, were not based on necessarily a research-oriented study and research findings. We were fortunate to have on our team, if you will, or in our family, I think the word is family, Dr. David Dubois, who was hired as a consultant on this effort, as well as what he's done with other OJJDP and national studies. So a real fortunate relationship or match for us. I think it's also instructive to note that the actual publication of the solicitation was initially put forward on July 12th of 2012 by the Library of Congress before the actual solicitation was put out into the field. And I think the Library of Congress put out the solicitation on the evaluation. And it was a very hot day. I remember it well. Had no power and living in DC with the humidity, off the charts. Just finding a area to read about this Library of Congress solicitation, and then I reached out to Roger, and that sort of was the stage set for our growing a new family. The solicitation did include for prospective grantees a checkbox for participating in an evaluation. I underscore that because for many of you on the webinar today, you know that you check off a box occasionally, and you may or may not know what you're getting yourself into. And I think that it's a reality of our work with our collaboratives in the last 4.5 or 5 years. Next slide, please. So American Institutes for Research, with the guidance of Roger and our other colleagues, we had to become fact finders for the backdrop and the background about what OJJDP expected and how we would need to collaborate with the funder. Similarly, we needed to build quote unquote mentoring relationships with personnel at OJJDP. And I think Jen Tyson, who Roger mentioned, has been a real fortunate enhancement, if you will, to the OJJDP team. We had to also spend quality time reviewing the various proposals and funded efforts that were going to be a part of the mentoring enhancement demonstration program. So we did invest time, energy, and resources to learn about the collaboratives and the agencies within those collaboratives. To say that our relationship evolved is certainly relevant, but the actual structure of the collaboratives evolved. They weren't necessarily formal collaboratives, rather they had come together to seek funding through this grant opportunity in the mentoring field. Next slide, please. The word at the top of this says cultivating. I think before we were able to cultivate, we had to plant the seeds. And I think there's a process that we engaged in. We had instituted very early on regular phone and email communication with our agencies within the collaboratives and always maintaining key contact with the lead person or persons. There were certainly some communication challenges, given that agencies involved in the collaboratives were involved in different kinds of programming efforts and activities and schedules. So we needed to accommodate that. Bear in mind, our own research team was sort of planted around the globe because Carla Herrera was living in Austria, Tom Keller was living or lives in Portland, Oregon. So Roger and Manolia Tanyu did a great job of making sure that we were mindful of putting our schedules together with an eye toward an international timeline. We developed an early strategy to go out and meet with the various collaborative agencies. And this was a very, very strong initial effort on our part. And I think it helped us facilitate our work with the collaboratives, and it also helped to lay the groundwork for the nature, the breadth, and the depth of the research study. And not all people were entirely happy campers to learn about the dimensions of this. It was quite a growth experience for some of the collaborative sites. We became cheerleaders, so encouragement was, again, a part of our mantra. Next slide. The team that was in these different collaboratives was varied, and the agencies were often from vastly different orientations and goals, if you will. So that became something that we needed to work on at the front end. One example, just as a little insight, one of our sites was comprised of a school-based organization that worked with young people, minority youth who were not from families where there had been previous college experience. In the same agency, there was a nationally recognized mental health organization that had only begun to work in the field of mentoring a couple of years prior to earning this grant. And then the third agency was a member of Goodwill Industries International and had previously gotten some funding through their national office, which in fact was provided originally by OJJDP. The demonstration project is, I think, at the core of this. We were trying something out by introducing new engagement of mentors and mentees in intentional efforts. And I think it is worthy to note that there was some forward thinking from OJJDP that's important, and it contributed to the work that we were able to do. Learning to use findings to inform program practices was certainly another dimension of our program support. And I think we worked hard on that, and in some cases it had payoffs that we can acknowledge and see, and you'll learn about them on the 30th of November. I think consistency was variable in that effort, and the outcomes show that. Next slide. Roger, is this me or you? I guess this is me. Okay.
Yeah.
All of the sites were required to establish structured relationships between a volunteer adult and one or more youth. And I think looking at the variety of constituencies from which programs recruited mentors is something to bear in mind. One of our study sites was dependent entirely on college students from 3 universities. And for those of you on the webinar today, you know that there are sometimes real positive benefits from that and genuine programmatic operational challenges. The established program sites were so diverse that it was at times even important for us to create a culture of conversation among them. If you're working in a school-based program rather than a community-based program, it might be very, very different. The collaboratives were required to implement a specific design of a program that they uniformly needed to sign on for. And that also took some time to create, develop, and in turn implement. They had to serve 75 to 100 new youth per site. And some of the sites, when we went out to visit them for our initial orientation, sort of looked at Roger and the others on our team like, 75 to 100? You got to be kidding. Where am I going to find these kids? The targeted age group for this was 12 to 14. So I turn it back to Roger, but I think one word that I would leave with you all is that complexity imbued the implementation complexity. Back to you, Roger.
Okay, thanks. So just a little bit, just to give you a flavor for, who was involved. So here we see, it was just over half of the kids were girls, 43% African American, 30% white, 29% Latino. We did have at least one site that strategically focused on Native American youth. And then the average age was just over 12. You see that it really was, we had kids across the full continuum, 12 to 14, 12 to 15. And then we had one site that focused on kids in school, so a lot of 11-year-olds for that. Let's go to the next one. So we asked parents at the baseline about risk factors that kids were experiencing, family, and involvement in programs. And so you can see generally in terms of environmental risk factors, a majority of the kids were experiencing those. A little less than half experiencing some of the individual risk factors. About a quarter of them were already involved in counseling or therapy or getting special help in school before this started. And then you could also see that a number of them were already involved in after school activities and other, outside of school activities as well too. Go on to the next. Here's a little bit about who the mentors were. 57% females, average age was 32, 81% were employed, 31% college students, 61% of the mentors were single, had never been married, and then you can see the breakdown here. So interesting that the gender breakdown was pretty close to what we saw for the youth, but pretty different for the terms of the race ethnic breakdown for the mentors. Go ahead to the next one. Here's a little bit more about the background of the mentors. So, we asked mentors at baseline, what experience they had with young people before this. You'll see that just under a quarter of them had actually been mentors in another program. So for the majority of them, this was a new experience in that capacity. We did have a number that had worked with kids previously, many in helping profession type jobs. A small number, about a fifth, had already been parents. Go ahead. And then here's a little bit about the matches. So characteristics of the matches themselves. So you can see that, and so here, so you'll see as we go through, so we're comparing, kids were randomly assigned to either be in the treatment group, which is, we call that the enhancement group, or that you'll see that on the slides as EG and for the enhancement group, or in the business as usual group. That's the control group, and that's the darker blue color. So we'll use that color scheme throughout when we're comparing the two groups. Here you see not much difference, certainly not statistically significant differences in terms of the length of the match. About the kids, their matches lasted at least a year, and the vast majority were at least 6 months or longer in terms of the length of the match. And again, which we already sort of saw a preview, about 53% of the matches had the same race and ethnicity, but 97% had the same gender. Go ahead to the next. And then just to give you a flavor, so as Janet mentioned, so the programs applied for the funding and they had to come in as a collaborative of 3 to 5 mentoring programs. Most of them had 3 programs. There were 2 that had 4 programs in the study. And so this just gives you a feel for the range of the types of programs. So at the program, so 4 of the collaboratives had school-based programs. All 10 of the collaboratives featured community-based mentoring programs. All 10 of them featured one-on-one mentoring. There were 3 collaboratives that featured at least 1 program that was providing group mentoring. If you can see in terms of the size of the mentoring program, so this is about the number of matches that they were serving annually in the year prior to starting in MADP. There were 3 collaboratives that had programs that had been serving more than 1,000 matches a year. 4 of them had programs that had not even been serving 100 matches a year. And there were 6 collaboratives that all of the agencies in the collaborative mentoring was the primary activity prior to coming into the study. Okay, let's go on. So I'm going to turn it back to Janet, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what we learned about the collaboratives and the strengths of the collaboratives.
Thanks, Roger. So the word collaboration was certainly at the core of what our team needed to articulate, promote, and foster, because, as I think was mentioned earlier, the collaboratives had come together to seek a funding opportunity, and that's all good. That is differentiating from whether or not they were established collaboratives. It was a conglomeration, if you will, of agencies that wanted to promote and foster more mentoring for young people in their communities. So the variability among the collaborations, if you will, was front and center. And we tried to work with each of these collaboratives. And as Roger just mentioned, 6 of the collaboratives were long-standing mentoring-oriented groups, but the other 4 were not. And I think that to a large degree, we let them work out how they were going to do that, because our mission was to foster their engagement, participation, and positive approach to the evaluation. That was something that we needed to spend more time on than I think we anticipated. That said, the tenor in this country in 2012, when this solicitation was published, was becoming much more lively around the concept of collaboratives, and became something that continues to this day, and it's actually got more energy in 2018 than it did in 2012, come together, and funders are going to look at this as a better return on investment. The evolution of the collaboratives differed across the 10. So that's not unusual for us to find, but it's just a reality check. Next slide. I think that it's important to look at how the collaboratives did work together, and to some degree, the leadership and the governance by the lead agency was paramount here. And some people had knowledge about the value add of collaboration. Others were learning to work together. The shared vision around implementation of the enhancements was another learning lesson. And if you were an organization that focused on group mentoring, then you had one vision. If you were an agency that was participating in this new collaboration focused on one-on-one, the shared vision took a bit of time to be manifest. Capacity and structure of the agencies within collaboratives was indeed another factor that we needed to address. One of the agencies within one collaborative had only just completed the first 3-year grant in mentoring that this organization had ever been a party to. So mentoring was not necessarily woven into the culture and the fabric. Next slide. Personnel matter in any environment. And I do want to, I don't have a hat on at the moment, but I would tip my hat to Roger for being a good leader of this amazing adventure. At the collaborative level, for those groups that we were working with, the key personnel were definitely a factor in how things were implemented, the results, and the spirit, if you will, of mentoring. Executive leadership needed to be a party to this whole endeavor. When agency execs were not there and the communication was not so hot, that diminished probably the likelihood of them being as successful as perhaps they might have been. Organizational culture is different, and the populations you serve are different. In one of the collaboratives, there were 3 different state agencies, in effect, that they had to be monitored by. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. These are 3 different kinds of state agency policy structures that influence nonprofit organizations. The extent of the mentoring experience, I think I've referenced, and it factored into our work. It lent some additional energy on our part to working with them. Some of the sites that were previously involved in other evaluations certainly knew about evaluation requirements, and they came to the table pretty quickly. Others, not so much. The presence of a full-time project director had a considerable impact. If you had a project coordinator or director, that helped get the communication out on a regular basis, someone who could bring the parties of the different agencies together. And stability of key personnel, clearly a factor. Next slide. One highly competent staff person makes a difference. And so for many of the people on the webinar, you know that. They can maintain a vision and a focus and a purpose, and also be sensitive to fidelity of the mission of this study. Creation of tools to guide implementation. We worked on that, and I would have to, again, pay tribute to an amazing group of data managers that helped our collaboratives come to the table for reporting and sharing their data and asking questions, learning to ask that there are no dumb questions. Agreement across the partners on the enhancements, that was a little tricky. One of our collaboratives approached advocacy with the perspective that that was only something that you did before your state legislature, and they were timid about putting advocacy into the language about the enhancement to their mentoring program. So that was just a factor, and I would have to say, because I consider myself a strong advocate for vulnerable youth, getting people over the hurdles of talking to your legislators about your program and not wearing a legislator's hat is a trick to be learned. Partners from some of the national affiliate organizations brought to the table advantages in their experience with their national affiliates, and some of them had certainly had the benefit of previous funding from OJJDP or other federal agencies. The nature and the diversity of the community served, it was all over the map. So we had agencies or collaboratives on the Eastern Seaboard, and some in Utah, some in California. Our startup trainings, where we went out to the sites and worked and met with the people, was a good early initial match for us. And again, that was a function of being clever and innovative, I think, from Roger's standpoint and Manolia's, about directing our resources appropriately. Next. The changes and the staff turnover turned out to be a fundamental issue at some points in the studies for some of the collaboratives. The size of the programs didn't necessarily translate into their outcomes, but whether or not they had enough staff to do this work, in some cases they did, in other cases They hadn't scoped that out. And that's not surprising because they didn't know exactly what they were getting into. The staff support in terms of supporting matches needed to be consistent. It needed to be there. And that was a fundamental element of our evaluation and of this requirement. The staff experience with mentoring and youth development, it's always a mixture. It's eclectic. It's a nice menu of people. Sometimes having only one single MSW on staff to do all of the staff support is a formula, as I'm sure Mike would agree, we found in JUMP. That's not necessarily the pathway to success. And communication among partners, whether it's among the partners on the senior design team or with our own funder and with all of the organizations participating in MADP, pretty big issue, but we resolved it, and I think we came out with a good story to tell. Over to you, Roger.
Okay, so I think, Mike, did you want to take some questions at this point, or?
Yeah, yeah, we had just a couple of questions come in. One of them I think you're going to get to on the next bit of slides, Roger, about kind of what exactly the advocacy enhancements kind of looked like. One of them, though, was around kind of the programs that were allowed to participate here. And a question from Jim wondering, whether these programs were kind of asked up front or had to demonstrate in some way whether they were in compliance with kind of known best practices. Specifically, he mentioned the elements of effective practice, the newest edition of that. So was there any kind of check on these programs, at least in terms of their eligibility to participate around, did they already have to exhibit some level of kind of proven quality at that level?
So they needed to show that they had been established programs for at least 3 years. So that was the requirement. And there may have been an assumption, by OJJDP that would signal that they were, familiar with or working on those, but they didn't need to show in order to be awarded the funding that they were, had adopted the elements or other evidence-based practices. So they needed to come forward with a plan, right? How they were going to, what the enhancements were going to look like. So they needed to lay that out in their proposal. So that was also part of the reason that some were picked over others. But yeah, so it's a good question.
Yeah. No, thanks, Roger. And I think, keep sending your questions in, folks. We may go a little bit past the top of the hour to answer a few of those if we get some really good ones. But Roger, I'm going to send it back over to you to kind of talk a little bit more about the work that these programs did.
Yep. Okay. So here's, so this sort of pulls together in a summary fashion what were the ways that the programs came up with the enhancements. So they were expected to do training and support for the mentors. And so the first two big categories are training. So programs had in-person trainings and new online trainings. You can see, again, the number of collaboratives that shows that as the way that they were going to introduce enhancements to their training. And then around match support too. 8 of the collaboratives, their enhancement was going to be that they were going to provide focused support. So there were going to be specific ways that they were going to coach the mentors, if you will, around building in the advocacy and teaching functions. Some of it was about focused practices. So things like Sparks, goal setting being in, and then for 3 of the collaboratives, their enhancement was that they were going to have more frequent contact between the staff and the mentor, and this was compared to what their business as usual. So they all needed to come in with the business as usual model, and then the enhancements were being compared to those. Some of the sites, this wasn't required, but some of them built in some peer mentor supports. so ways that mentors could support each other. And so there were some online support options and then in-person support options. This was a smaller number of collaboratives that opted to do this. One of the things we did hear from mentors was, that when they had a chance to interact with other mentors, that was among the most beneficial experiences that they had. And then that last category there, match activities, were activities that the programs offered as part of the enhancements where the mentor and the mentee could come together as part of it. And so there were program-sponsored match activities and then other group activities where mentors could come. The program-sponsored ones were more thematic and tied more to the advocacy and teaching functions. And so among all of those, there were 2 collaboratives that proposed 3 enhancements, so 3 of those. There were 3 collaboratives that planned on 4 enhancements, 3 collaboratives that planned 5. And then there were 2 that either did 6 or 7, where it was their plan. And so that's what we evaluated. So let's go to the next slide. And so when we think about, so how did they do? So they had a plan, and then we looked at, so there were 4 collaboratives that really only achieved partial implementation of their enhanced practices. The other 6 implemented the enhancements fully, although we will acknowledge that 2 of those 6 needed to make some adaptations to the enhancements in order to fully implement, which made changes in the way they were delivering the training or the schedule or how many trainings were required. So that's what we learned about how, in terms of the extent of implementation. Let's go to the next. So here was, there's a lot on here, but this really lays out for you what it was we thought we were going to be testing here. So this was the kind of the theory. And so if you go to the next slide, so I break this up into 2 or smaller pieces so we can kind of zoom in here. So if we move from left to right, so what we were trying to see is if there were enhancements to the training and enhancements to the way that mentors were supported by staff, that should influence whether they were incorporating teaching functions into their role and incorporating advocacy functions into their role. And then if you go to the next slide. And so then the second half of this, moving across then. So these were the outcomes. So we thought that if they did change, if the mentors were adopting those behaviors, it should impact the relationship quality. And that should lead to the young people being more connected in the community, connected to other adults, and then ultimately, changes in more positive behavioral outcomes here. So that's what we're looking at. And so this, we tried to assess all of this in terms of our evaluation. Let's go to the next. So one of the things and by laying this out, and one of the things we really worked with the programs on is, the theory was based on the programs doing something different, which should influence the mentors to behave in different ways, right, in order to get those outcomes, right? And so we really, really focused on whether or not the enhancements were being delivered and whether the mentors were reporting that they were incorporating those behaviors. And one of the things we saw, this was probably the biggest key challenge to implementation, was getting the mentors to participate in terms of attendance, being engaged in the process here. This was something that all the programs experienced. And so I think one of the things that we became aware of, as we really looked at what did we learn from this, was the programs did a great job. I think we all felt like the programs, all of the collaboratives, came up with some really nice planned enhancements, but then didn't probably think enough upfront about how they were going to encourage full, attendance and participation by the mentors. So this is something that, is worth really thinking about in your own programs as you try to make those changes. Let's go into the next. And in terms of the way that we analyzed and sort of our assumptions that we brought to our implementation study, was that there were all these factors that were working on, whether or not programs implemented the enhancements as they were designed. And so if you think the outer circle here really is sort of the community context, things that were sort of operating on them from the community, but also to MADP, right? Janet went through, all of the expectations of and the structure of the initiative, and that did shape the way programs went about providing the program, all right? And then there were also then that middle circle there, the collaboratives themselves, how they work together, the leadership from the collaborative, and that influenced the way they were implementing the enhancements. And then in the middle there, at the program level too, right? The organizational capacity and even their specific capacity around MADP, which Janet alluded to. Did they have enough staff? Did the staff, was the staff consistent? Were there changes there? Often the turnover happened at the level of the staff who were providing support to the mentors. And, we heard in some sites that mentors were on their third or fourth match support specialist. When they got later into their into the life of their match. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we did spend a lot of time really thinking about, okay, what does this mean? Teaching and advocacy, and what does it look like? And so this was a framework that we developed from talking with the program. So we did a series of focus groups that Janet facilitated for all the sites. All the collaboratives brought together, and then she and Tom Keller worked together, and some of Tom's students, to think about, okay, so what kind of a framework, what kind of organization can we think about in terms of the way programs were thinking through what are the teaching functions, what are the advocacy functions. So here are the different categories that sort of fell into here. So you'll be able to take a look at this when you get the slides and think more about this. We will also have there'll be an article coming out too that goes more deeply into to this framework here. I will tell you, so just to let you know, that this we developed along the way, but this was developed in talking with the staff after we created the survey instrument. So the way that we assessed whether mentors were incorporating advocacy and teaching didn't quite line up with this framework, and that just had to do with the timing of how we created our tools. Let's go to the next. So the other thing we looked at is the cost, right? So, how does it measure up with business as usual? You'll see here, so if you look at the cost here, just a little bit more. The enhancements, just a little bit more expensive than the business as usual. This is not even a statistically significant difference here. The higher costs seem to be focused, tied to the staff time that was involved in supervising the matches, particularly where programs, their enhancement was to spend more time with the mentors, but also the post-match trainings and the activities and the events that they designed. Let's go on to the next. So in terms of the enhancements themselves, so as you see, here we're comparing business as usual to enhancement. The orange here is enhancement. And so about equal, those groups, in terms of training that happened prior to the match starting, but we see the big difference in after the match started. And that's really where programs came in and did the training around the advocacy and teaching functions in here. So quite a significant difference between the programs. Here we know from working with the sites that the mentors in the enhancement group spend about 50% longer than their counterparts in the control group in support conversations with program staff. Again, which was a good indication because that was the design of the enhancement. Let's go to the next. Here you see this is the participation in the support activities. These are the peer activities between the mentors, and again, the lighter blue here, those are the enhancement sites. You can see that across we have only these are only the collaboratives that had this as one of their enhancements, and in each one of them we see significant differences in the mentors reporting having received those. Go to the next. And then these are the program-sponsored activities, right? These are the activities that the matches could come to the mentor and mentee together. You'll see here there were 5 collaboratives that had this as one of their enhancements. One, collaborative A at the bottom there. What we learned is that these activities were already in place, and so not necessarily something that only the enhancement matches were encouraged to do. So we didn't find a difference there, but we did find significant differences in each of the other collaboratives. Go ahead to the next. So here's where we were asking, we asked mentors if they experienced support from staff around building in the teaching and advocacy functions. And here again, there were several sites that we found significant differences. So these scores here are on a 5-point scale, you know, a Likert scale that mentors. And again, favoring where the enhancement mentors got more attention. This was more intentional in terms of the way that the time was spent in conversation with staff. Go on to the next. So here's a couple of summary points about the way that mentors went about incorporating teaching and advocacy functions. They did report more frequently incorporating the teaching functions. So the teaching were things that had to do with, you know, showing kids how to do something, providing support for learning about things. Advocacy functions tended to be more about connecting them to other resources, connecting them to other support systems, and doing things on their behalf when they weren't together. So we found that mentors were reporting more frequently incorporating the teaching functions. When we asked the young people, were your mentors behaving in this way? The enhancement kids were more likely to report that their mentor was trying to help them reach goals. And the content of the goals, the discussions around goals from the mentor's perspective, suggested that there was a more planned approach to goal attainment among the matches in the enhancement condition. And we also, from the mentors, heard that they were more likely to agree that the programs assisted them in supporting the youth spark development too. Go on to the next. Here, just another look at, you know, when the mentors, whether mentors were reporting, working with the young people on goal setting. And again, so there were a number of collaboratives that this was strategic, and those we found pretty big differences, and across the board. And then a number of them that were where we didn't see a difference here. It is interesting. We did see, and this is one of the things that we learned from MADP, is that, you know, this goal setting here was not something that programs weren't doing anything of, right? And so, you know, nearly 40% or more in every one of the collaboratives, the mentors were saying, you know, hey, this is something I was working with. And so it was already part of the thinking, part of the culture for what mentors should be doing in these programs. Let's go to the next. So when we asked mentors, how did you experience the enhancement? So here's just some summary points here. So when mentors did attend the training sessions, they found them helpful, and they reported using tips or pointers or offered in those sessions. They reported higher levels of agreement than the control mentors. When they were asked, did program staff provide suggestions on what they could do with their mentee? When mentors attended the program-sponsored match activities, again, they found those helpful. They found them that they strengthened their relationship with their mentees. But we didn't find, but if the control mentors went to those activities, they also found that those were helpful as well. And again, when mentors were able to interact with other mentors as part of the enhancements, they always reported that as helpful. That was something that was quite significant. Let's go to the next. Just again, and I'll let you spend some time looking at this later, but just we did come up with sort of a classification of, you know, so if we were looking at, so here we say strong and mixed, but, you know, this is really the full implementation versus the partial implementation that I referenced earlier. And just some of the factors that we found were responsible for that in terms of context and even readiness too. So, I mean, it was clear to us after having spent, you know, years, you know, really working with the programs and studying them, was that, you know, being ready to be part of the initiative and even be part of a rigorous randomized control trial was important, right? And something to keep in mind of that. Let's go on to the next. All right. So, and then this is the last point. So, or I guess I have one more after this. So here's what we learned about how MADP really did increase capacity. So we know that the programs ended up with new materials and new tools for training mentors. They had better or different strategies around support, and even for many of them created checklists. You know, these are the things we were going to talk about. They developed resources for mentors in many of the collaboratives, increased capacity to recruit volunteers and families in the community where they were situated. They increased capacity to serve older youth. This was a new experience for many programs to work with kids, you know, 12 to 14. For many of them, the volunteers that they had were looking to mentor kids younger than that. Increase the agency's capacity to support staff, increase their capacity to use technology, and even the networking and partnerships with other agencies we saw as something that programs benefited from by being part of MADP. And then to the next one. And one last point that I'll just leave you with here is we really saw again and again that increasing dosage really made a difference, right? It matters if you increase how much training is provided. That was a key factor that made a difference, how long they were in training. It mattered how much contact staff had with the mentors. That was probably the most significant factor of them all. And it matters how much time the match spent together focused on the advocacy and teaching functions. When mentors reported spending more time focused on what we would consider to be the advocacy and teaching functions, we saw better outcomes for those matches too. And with that, that's all we had organized to present, but we have a few minutes left. We can take some additional questions.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And I really appreciate you kind of walking folks through these findings around the implementation of it, because, you know, I really enjoy seeing the ways in which these programs were able to strengthen that relationship between mentor and program staff. And I think that's a good lesson for anybody doing enhancements that are about anything. It doesn't have to be about teaching and advocacy. Often when you're going to ask mentors to do a little bit more than business as usual, that's going to require a stronger relationship and more interaction between staff and those mentors. And so I really, you know, think it's great that you were able to kind of show that this project was able to kind of build that in some really key ways. We have a couple of really great questions I want to get to, and Jim asked a really good one around, you know, look, it looks like there's a lot of quality enhancements being implemented at these sites, but without like a lot of increase in cost. And so he was wondering, were some of the business as usual activities reduced or eliminated, or were resources kind of realigned in order for them to do this extra work, but without extra money? I think Jim was curious as to how they managed that.
So I think one of the things we learned in the way that we collected the cost data was that the programs put a lot of the administrative, the capacity cost of it. So like the how much it costs to maintain their office space, their facility, the administrative costs tended to load more in the side of the business as usual. So we do worry that we don't have, because of that, then we're not seeing as clearly as we could be otherwise, how much more that the enhancements were provided. I mean, so everybody got a grant, right, to do this. The work that they did for the, you know, with the business as usual and the enhancements was all, was a lot of the funds that came in addition to what they already had. So yeah, we also thought we were going to see more of a difference there than we did on that.
Roger, could I say something here?
Of course.
I think a few of the collaboratives were successful in identifying an aspect of their enhancements that would be through a packaged program or a training opportunity that could be delivered in a cost-effective way. We had one collaborative select using the True Colors package for matching. We had another collaborative that implemented a junior achievement program activity for mentors and mentees. And then others had their pre-developed packages that were already characterized as evidence-based programs, not necessarily evidence-based in the sense of elements of effective practice, but their own internal evidence-based programs validated by their national organization. I think those things were cost-effective choices.
Great, thanks, Janet. I want to be mindful of time. We're at the top of the hour. We'll wrap up here in just a minute, but I did want to ask another question that came in, actually two quick ones here, I think. April wanted to know, there was some online training involved here, right? It wasn't all in person. Is that correct, Roger?
That is correct.
Okay, and was there any difference in kind of what you looked at in terms of kind of the efficacy of online versus in person, or did certain timing of training matter? Was it better to do it all up front, or any variations there?
So we have not unpacked the differences in training in terms of efficacy yet. So that's something that we're going to be able to do. We haven't done that yet. We did see that we got there was better attendance at the in-person training than the online training. But the online training was a popular choice for programs in terms of their enhancements. So that was something that was popular among the programs.
Sure.
So yeah, but we haven't unpacked it more than that yet at this point. So yeah, so I don't have a better answer than that.
Sure. And then one last one, and maybe this will be a good teaser for what we're going to talk about on November 30th. But Jerry wanted to know, you mentioned these three key things, right? Increased training, increased staff contact with mentors, and increased time that the match spends together. Was there any one of those that really stood out as making a positive impact and kind of the ultimate results of this? I don't want to give away too much for our next webinar, but was one of those really the secret sauce to making this work, or did all three contribute?
So yeah, there's not one that. So all three of those are significant predictors of a better outcome. So yeah, so all of them, were where we found that that was in place, and that was the mentor's experience, then we saw better outcomes. I will say, so only a small number. There was only 3 collaboratives that played around with doing more. So compared to business as usual, they doubled the amount of time that they were spending with that. That was a really powerful strategy. Now, I realize there are resource implications to that for programs, but that by itself was a very significant factor. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind.
Sure.
So, Mike, you might just make note of the blog post that you're posting, because that's connected to what we're doing here today, right? That's from the voice of the programs themselves, right? In terms of the.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good recommendation, Roger. So what Roger's referring to there is on the National Mentoring Resource Center website. We have a blog that we post many topics on an ongoing basis. We're in the middle of doing a series right now of where we've asked the mentoring enhancement programs, many of them from around the country, to write a little post about their experience. We asked all of them kind of a similar set of questions about how it went, what was challenging, what was successful, what they're going to keep in place moving forward now that the grant has ended. So if you want to hear some real stories from what it was like on the ground to be part of a big effort like this, that series of blog posts is available there on the website. So in the interest of time here, I don't want to keep anyone any longer. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. I really appreciate Janet and Roger walking us through the implementation. I really hope folks come back, join us on November 30th, because we're going to find out whether all of this resulted in stronger relationships and better outcomes for the kids participating in the program. And so if you want to kind of see the final step in what we learned here, join us on the 30th for that. I will be sending out a link to the recording and the slides for this early next week. And remember, if this has inspired you to make any enhancements in your programming and what you offer mentors and kids, remember, you can always get free technical assistance in doing that through the NMRC. There's a big shiny request technical assistance button right there on the homepage of the site. So thank you again to Roger and Janet, and for everyone for joining us today. And we will see you on November 30th. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.